Thank you very much. May we please settle back in for our final presentation.
Well, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I don't know why they picked on me. I thought they was pick someone with a sweeter voice than mine, not this husky thing that you hardly hear with some comfort. Anyways, it's been a very successful event and one that has been well thought after, well delivered, lessons learned and taken, and perhaps the beginning of the end of retrogression of the potentials and activities of tourism in Nigeria. Mr. President, the local organizing committee, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I have just been honored a few minutes ago to declare this summit closed. Therefore, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful, bestower of knowledge and wealth, I humbly and most sincerely thank all of you for coming and have the privilege and honor to declare this forum closed. Thank you very much for coming.
Sustainable transportation equity, recreating mobility for people and tourism, which will be presented by Engineer John Emmanuel, HOD Administration and Strategy, Transportation Growth Initiative.
The Honorable Minister of State Aviation, who has just left, permit me, ladies and gentlemen, to stand on existing protocol. Please, may I have my paper shot on the screen? I am John Emmanuel from Transportation Growth Initiative. In brief, Transportation Growth Initiative is an organization of different professionals in the transport sector, including government agencies and private sector, who together came together in 2012 to form an organization that will have an independent voice in driving initiatives in the transportation sector. And I'm glad to be in the Secretariat. We have a host of agencies and organizations in this hall are members of the Transportation Growth Initiative. But today, if you want to know more about it, we have a stand right there before the gate. You could get additional information. Can we go ahead? Can you please go to the next slide? Next one. The core message of this paper is that the world exists for people. So are cities built for people, not for cars. Permit me to say that our approach to project implementation in Nigeria is like somebody who is sick. He's having headache, he's having ear pain, And then they said, head is more important. If you remove the head, that means the person is dead. So let's leave the ear and attend to the head. So we go ahead to solve the headache, not knowing that what is causing the headache is actually the ear pain. So we address the big things, and a number of times we leave the small things that really matters. And that is the core of this paper. By way of definition, I'd like to go to the next slide. What is a good city? Don't forget, we are talking about tourism and transportation. What attracts people to a city differs in individuals, but there are certain things that are fundamental. And I'd like to mention a few of them which defines a good city. And what is a good city? A city where people live, people want to live, and people want to visit. There are 6 parameters among others, but fundamentally there are 3 that affect my area of presentation. Number 1 is a place where there is interaction, inspiration, and participation. Everybody have a sense of belonging. The next point is seamless and intermodal mobility, which of course has been some of the issues been talking about. And the third one is a place where young people and old people have a good belief to want to live, to want to keep existing. The next slide, I'd like to look at 4 definitions there, but my attention will be on 2. There are key words that defines this presentation. Number 1 is transportation. Number 2 is equity. Number 3 is sustainability. And number 4 is mobility. Now, look at the difference between transportation and mobility. Transportation deals with movement of people and goods from one place to the other. Mobility is concerned more with the ability and freedom of people to move, the ease at which they move. That's why when you're referring to transportation within urban centers as transport, you limit the capacity of stakeholders to understand exactly what they need to do. What is fundamental is the ability of people, the ease at which they move from destination to destination. I give a simple example. We have just had a lot of celebrations over the rail transport from Abuja to Kaduna. And we're just talking a few minutes ago about how that if I want to go to Kaduna from here, I will need to take a taxi from the city, about 1,000 or 1,500 from here to Idu. I pay 1,000, 1,500 to Idu. Then I enter the train from Idu to Rigasa. Then from Rigasa, I will need to take another taxi, about 500 or 700 to the city. Now, the total cost would have been about 4,000 or 4,000 something. That is if I don't have a car and a driver to go and drop me. Now, the purpose of having a rail system that is available to the common man has been defeated. So the man who needs to use the rail will prefer to go and stand by the roadside in Bega and take a taxi by the roadside to Kaduna. So you have a greater majority of the population preferring to use the road, while those who are already well-to-do are the ones using the rail. And that defeats the fundamentals of urban mobility. So let's look at quickly a few problems that I've outlined here. Can I have the next slide? A few problems. And number 1 of that problem, don't forget we are talking tourism, which means what the city is determines the attractiveness it will be to tourists and to people who want to live in such a city. And number 1 of such thing is population growth and urbanization. We are growing at a rate that is terrific. We are growing at a rate that challenges every continent and every nation. And I'd like us to look at it in the next slide, where we have Nigeria growing to become the third largest population in the world by 2050 if the pace of growing at the moment continues. Next slide. I'm going to rush. And more importantly, more people are already living in the cities than they live in the rural areas. And the trend is going to continue. For instance, Abuja is growing at about 5% per annum. If that sustains, what happens in the next generation? Let's look at the next slide. Now, we have Nigeria, Netherlands, and Japan. I just did a comparison. You can see the graph. Nigeria is consistently on the upward growth. The other two nations have reached their peak and the population is dropping. But Nigeria is consistently on the upward growth. The other slide there shows, the other graph there shows Lagos, Tokyo, and Japan for a period of 20 years. This is the growth difference. While Lagos has grown 138% within 20 years, New York has only grown for just 8%, while Tokyo has grown for 5%. So if in 20 years we are where we are, at the next 20 years, what will happen? We are having a situation where the cities will be too loaded. We keep expanding roads. A time will come, perhaps we collapse all the houses and turn them to roads. And that is not going to happen because it is not the pattern, it's not the model that is consistent with current practice. You keep expanding, but a time will come, there will be no more space to expand. So what do? Will you start killing the people? Or how do people move? People keep coming to the city, and the city landmass is not going to expand. We do not even have the resources to match the demand for infrastructure if we continue the way we are going. Next slide. The second issue is road traffic crashes, which the paper by my boss from the FRSA has addressed. But fundamentally, I like to emphasize the fact that about 38% of the fatalities in Africa, according to World Bank, of all the fatalities come from pedestrians who die on the road. And that should pose a concern to us. In essence, if 6,000 people are dying, going by the World Bank data, it means about 2,000 of them or more are dying in our cities. That means something is wrong with our urban mobility programs. Let's go next slide. This shows what the loss is causing us. But please let's go ahead for the sake of time. The next point is how much space does the car occupy in the cities? We do not seem to understand. There was a building of a headquarters of one of the government agencies in Abuja that was to be built a few years ago in Abuja here. The budget was for 4 billion naira. Now, when the development control of FCDA came there to certify the building, they discovered the provision for car park was not sufficient. And so it was required that they buy additional land and build additional facilities to accommodate the car. That took the budget from 4 billion to 7 billion. So the car is occupying almost the same space as humans. The car is challenging the well-being of humanity. Next slide. This is Lagos in 1960. People riding bicycle and walking. But by 1980, the road is jammed. What happens in 2050? Next slide. This slide gives us some indexes, particularly the livability index, as well as the road safety rating of nations. Now, this one shows the livability index, which is conducted by the economists from the UK across the world and acceptable. 40 countries, 40 cities from different countries were analyzed. Lagos was one of them, and Lagos took 39th position in terms of the livability. That is a city where people want to live. Don't forget, that is the main topic of my talking. Then the next one is, okay, let's proceed. More challenges. We have traffic congestion that is consuming a lot of people's times. I was telling somebody who shared with me. He said that time the traffic along Maraba Road was still very terrible. And he said she and her children eat their breakfast in the car coming to the office and eat dinner in the car going back. Because there are schools in Masaka where she stayed. But if she put the children in school there, when the school closes, there will be nobody to carry them. So she comes to office with them, put them in a school nearby the office, and carry them. Then the children form part of the office with her after school until she closes. We don't know how much that is costing our families today. We have issues of, permit me, I can't see clearly from here, so let me use my paper here. We have issues of pollution, we have issues of global warming, we have issues of tear and wear on the roads and all of that. Then the question comes to mind. Next slide is here. How did we get here? Everybody came as a pedestrian. Everybody at one time or the other walks. Then we had bicycles, a time of bicycle, the pre and during colonial era. And then once you buy the motorcycle, you become a big boy. Then you buy the car, and then you wonder what people are doing trekking on the road, and you think it's poverty that is making the person riding bicycle to continue to ride. Then you buy the aeroplane, and then you stand up there, you are waving everybody, and you think you are a big boy. This is how we came, and we must return back to where we are coming from. Next slide. The way forward is sustainable equity and mobility. Public transport combined with cycling and walking. It is the prevailing urban mobility practice everywhere across the world. And we must come to a point of agreement that this is where we can solve the problem. Don't forget, if you are talking about tourism, you are talking about the well-being of the people, the willingness and the goodness of the people to enjoy the city where they live. Next slide. And I am not the one that said that public transport combined with cycling is the answer. Some people said it. So you are talking about United Nations resolutions from different platforms, including the New Urban Agenda in 2016, the 7 targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, which talks about mobility in urban centers. We have the Future We Want, which is a report by the UN. We have the Global Sustainable Transport Outlook, and so many of such. All of this points to one thing, that the car has become much of an enemy to humanity, and the time is ripe for us to do something to change it. Next slide. There are 3 revolutions building up. One is the current practice where the car continues to multiply, people continue to die on the highways. Governments and government agencies responsible for that are making effort, and it's not solving the problem. Pollution continues, which means we continue to have depletion of the ozone layer, leading to a lot of climate challenges and global warming. And then, so if we have the car continue to be what it is, by 2050, this is what we will have. Presently we have 2.1 billion cars across the world, which emit about 4.6 billion megatons of CO2. So if we move to the next revolution, which is what everybody is crying for, revolution that says let's use electric cars, let's use autonomous vehicles, let's use different automations to define how we move. If we get to that, the number of cars in our cities will remain the same. It will not reduce. Although CO2 emissions will reduce to about 1.7 billion megatons. But if we agree with sustainability and equity, which is the emphasis of this paper, we're going to be having just 500 million cars instead of 2.1 billion that we have in our urban centers. In that case, we'll be focusing on the car and the bicycle, and then pedestrians within urban centers. In that case, we need to develop policies, we need to develop infrastructure, we need to make the roads safe, and then we convert people from riding personal cars, because we have cities, we have compounds where 5 people are living in the same compound, 5 of them work in Federal Secretariat, and 5 of them ride cars to Federal Secretariat, because car is a status symbol, and we must migrate from that attitude. Next slide. So, and I mentioned here that the case is not that of Nigeria alone. Different countries are suffering the same, but they are doing something, which we are not doing as much. Okay. Next slide. This is Amsterdam, a city known for cars before 1970. You see the first picture up there shows an empty city at a time that there were no cars as much. So 1950, the same building, that building is a hotel. It's a restaurant. So you see empty space. By 1960, it's occupied by the car. Then by 2007, they have replaced a car culture with cycling and public transport. So you go to the second slide, the other side of the slide, you see public transport. What you see there is a tram, which is similar to a light rail or maybe a senior bus, if you want to call it, with bicycle. So you could ride your bicycle from wherever you are, like we have in Idu right now. You ride your bicycle from the town to Idu. You have a place to keep it. Then you take your what we call the train to Kaduna. You also have where you can rent a bicycle from there to the city, and then you come back with it. And then this is how they have grown to make their cities. And we're going to see later, if time permits, whether we could look at some of the benefits that have accrued to them. Now, this is New York. Our roads are patterned after the New York system. Our urban mobility system are patterned after the US system, building wide roads for flowing cars that runs and kills people. But this New York City have since realized that the car comes at a cost. And they are modifying cities, modifying roads, converting them to bicycle lanes, converting them to public places where people can sit down on the road to have fun. And we need to begin to tow in that direction. Next slide. Now look at this intersection. Next slide. The same intersection. What did they do to change the entire story? They just did some paintings and earmarked some places as places for bicycles. Next slide. Now look at the benefits that accrued to that little adjustment. It doesn't cost a lot of money. Speeding decreased by 16%. Regard for median increased by 14%. Injury and crash fell by 25%. 75% of users say this is the best they have ever had. This is what we need to do. This is where we need to go. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, go ahead. Next slide. This is Oxford Street. For some of you that have been in the UK and you are regular there, I had the privilege of being there at a certain time. And one of the good news is that there was a time the street is jammed with cars. Then it graduated to jammed with buses. And it came to a point the city knew that the solution is not in expansion. The solution is in removing the vehicle from the road and give people who are the owners of the city the right of way. So they are pedestrianizing the entire street. Next slide. This is Bogota. You can see just little adjustment and everything changes. Little adjustment and the city becomes sweet. Little adjustment and all the noise from taxis and vehicles end up. Little adjustment and you see serenity, you see peace, you see quietness. Next slide, okay. This is another city in Vienna. You see all of that. Next slide as I try to round up. This is Nairobi, a nearby city in Kenya, who are making tremendous efforts. And the efforts are not just in public transport, but it's also expanding. Just 2 weeks ago, they launched a bike share program where you can rent a bicycle for a certain amount, just little amount, to take you there and come back. Next slide. Lagos is doing well, just as it has been mentioned and other people are saying. Lagos, go to next slide. This is Abuja light rail program, which Mr. Kayode talked about earlier. Next slide. BRT, next slide. The light rail, which is almost complete, or rather completed and waiting to be commissioned. We are doing well. The only problem with our doing well is that they are standalone projects that have no connectivity. And I keep emphasizing that. One of the challenges is that how do I get to the station? How cost effective is it to get from where I live to where I should enter the station? If I'm living in Masaka, for instance, and I have a BRT or a light rail, how do I get from my house to the station? If the bus or the light rail carries me from the station to Bega, how do I get from Bega to Wuse 2 or Wuse Zone 2 where I work? These are the issues. And of course, until that is factored into our urban transportation planning, we have challenges of efficiency and effectiveness. Go ahead, next slide. Therefore, we must, as a matter of necessity, return building cities for cars and start building cities for people. We need to revolutionize reforms in the land use and housing sectors. We need to develop policies on population growth. We need to equitably provide transport facilities that cater for the needs of the disabled and every other person who is a member of society. And doing this will require that there is a shift. Next slide as I round up. Next slide, please. Okay. They said my time is up. So we need to invest more in ensuring that cycling, pedestrianization, and public transport take center stage in our effort to address the needs of people as well as the need of tourism. Once again, thank you for the privilege.
Thank you very much, Mr. John Emmanuel. I would like to call on the rapporteurs if the communique is ready.
Communique of the National Tourism and Transport Summit and Expo held at the International Conference Center, Abuja, issued this day, 22nd May 2018. Introduction. In line with efforts to enhance synergy between tourism and transport industry stakeholders to enable a robust and sustainable development of the industries for socio-economic benefits to the nation. In August 2017, the 15th National Council on Transportation approved the hosting of the Tourism and Transport Summit. During the conference, papers were presented and goodwill messages were presented, which elicited high level of interactions and consequent outcomes. The summit drew high-level dignitaries, including participation from the ministries, departments, and agencies of government, academia, private operators, and individuals. Different transport and transport-related organizations were also adequately represented, who networked and bare their minds on the burgeoning issues on the development of the transport and tourism industry. There was technical, professional, and operational papers presented by technocrats drawn from decision makers in the transport and tourism industry, academics, private practitioners, NGOs, and individuals. Observations. From the papers presented and the goodwill messages and comments from interactions, the following observations were drawn. Number one, that over the years, effective synergy has been lacking in the transport and tourism industry, which are interdependent. This makes the hosting of the Transport and Tourism Conference apt and key to the current efforts of the government to diversify the economy of Nigeria. Number two, that for any industry as transport and tourism to succeed, there must be a body of knowledge to drive development. Number three, transport is a fundamental enabler of tourism, and therefore a prerequisite for developing tourism in any nation. Number four, a major attraction to the tourism potentials of a city or nation is the efficiency, safety, security, and sustainability of its transportation system. Number five, that even though there are over 1 billion tourism arrivals worldwide, and will grow to 1.6 billion by 2020 with projected revenue of $1.5 trillion, Nigeria seems not to be drawing maximally from the benefits given our status. Number six, the approval of the National Transport Policy and consequent implementation represents a landmark requirement for enhancing efficiency, sustainability of the transportation industry, especially considering the symbiotic benefits to the tourism industry in Nigeria. Number 7, the economic, environmental, and social imperatives of the national transport policy needs to be mainstreamed in the interdependency of the transport and tourism industry. Number 8, the success story of Switzerland.
Sorry, sir. Please, sir, there is some observations, and we want to take them so that you can make necessary corrections immediately. Please, the first observation. Yes, the thing is lengthy. If we allow him to finish, we will not do it. They asked the president to stop for observation. Yes. Thank you.
Yes, the approval at the National Council was for annual hosting,
Okay.
not just a one-off hosting. So it should be an annual event.
Okay.
So just to include annual.
All right. Somebody's noting it down there for me. When I go down, we'll make the corrections. Is that okay?
Hello?
Okay. So number 9.
Hello?
For transportation to become a truly fundamental. Okay. Okay.
It is better if this is on the screen for us to follow you. And from what you read, that introductory section, I think it's too long.
Okay.
Where you draw on what happened in Sokoto,
Sokoto.
you should draw, at that point, draw on what happened here. The group, the divergent group that attended here, this particular one, is what you're supposed to mention, not...
No, it's here.
Oh, it's about what, the
Yes.
group, okay, not the Sokoto group.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Please, every comment you have, write it down so that at the tail end of the presentation, he will take the corrections once. Thank you very much.
Then number 9. Number 9. For transportation to become a truly fundamental enabler of tourism, there must be a shift from the current transportation practices to a more sustainable way. Number 10, airlines in Nigeria pays about 37 taxes put together, and this contributes a great deal to the cost of airfares in Nigeria, and that it is possible to reduce the cost of air return ticket, for instance, Abuja to Lagos, to as low as 14,000, if the taxes are substantially reduced or subsidy are provided. Number 11, that the driving culture, rickety vehicles on the roads, and parking habits on walkways are problems to tourism. Number 12, transport systems linking tourism destination, heritage sites, and cultural festival venues in Nigeria need serious attention if tourism is to earn greater revenue for Nigeria. Number 13, the tourism data deficit, as presently witnessed, is a major problem to the tourism development of Nigeria. Number 14, Nigeria is yet to see tourism as a major driver of the economy. Number 15, there is a gap between the practitioners and the academics in the transport and tourism industry, as is seen in this summit, where the academics are just a handful. Number 16, there is gross underutilization of the waterways, both for transport and tourism. Number 17, too many individuals and institutions claims ownership of transport and tourism business in Nigeria. Number 18, the appointment of personalities to head and lead government institutions on transport and tourism industry does not take sufficient cognizance of professionalism, This limits our growth and development. Number 19, the level of marketing in the tourism and transport industry is limited and needs to be intensified by the government leading from the front. Number 20, the intermodalism, particularly at the airports and seaports, leaves much to be desired. Number 21, the transportation sector should be seen as a social security because the profitability of it may not be viable enough to command a robust investment by the private sector. And finally, number 22, the overdependence on individuals on car mobility has left the country's land transportation system with more challenges than solutions. Recommendations. In the light of the observations above, participants resolved as follows. 1, that stakeholders in the transport and tourism sector in Nigeria should support and facilitate the hosting of this summit annually in line with the resolution of the NCT. Number 2, stakeholders in the transport and tourism industry, especially the government agencies, should remove all barriers to effective synergy that will sustain the robust symbiotic relationship in developing transport and tourism. Number 3, the approval of the National Transport Policy and its implementation is long overdue and waiting further is detrimental to the objectives for which it was set out. Hence, it should be approved. Number 4, responsible transport and tourism agencies should take responsibility to develop platforms for collation, analysis, and publishing of appropriate data for the industry. The Federal Minister of Transport, number 5 now, the Federal Minister of Transportation and Information and Tourism should facilitate